Hi, my name is Rose Wackley, and I'm going to be doing my deep dive vlog today on the topic of women and pleasure. So, I kind of want to focus more on why women's pleasure is not normalized, and there's many reasons why it's not. But I have chosen 3 pieces of evidence to take a little bit of each section on why it's not normalized in each one. So, the first one I want to talk about is a film found on Netflix called The Principles of Pleasure. And this documentary goes through immense amounts of reasons on why women's pleasure is not normalized and why society has pressure on women. But the one I want to focus on is societal pressure, and that includes religion, the fact that sex has become a male action and not for women, and also social media. So, religion, we're told, wait till marriage. If you have a sex education conversation, it's more of a conversation of reproduction, and this is what you're not going to do. And then the act of how sex has become a male action. I wanted to talk about this one girl who's on the show, and she said, "My father was a lifetime Playboy subscriber. I think my biggest takeaway that it was something a very attractive woman does for a man, like as a gift." So right here it proves to you that sex is not for women to enjoy. It's not meant for the pleasure of women. It's only meant for women to provide pleasure for a man, and that is it. And that goes into exactly what I'm about to talk about: social media, the way movies portray sex, the way other social media platforms are portraying sex. So this sets an expectation on what is realistic, what is not, and also the expectation of how a woman is supposed to behave, how a woman's supposed to be in sexual actions and stuff like that. The next is an article I found. It's 2016, Why Is There Still a Stigma Connected to Women and Sex? So women's pleasure has been stigmatized for many years. It's not spoken about, it's not advocated for, it's not put into education. So it's just not even in the world right now talked about at all. So I wanted to take a deeper look into how women feel about their own pleasure and desires. So this article talks about a girl named Naomi Katz. She's a high school teacher living in New York City at the age of 23. And on the streets daily, she's catcalled, and it disgusted her. But what disgusted her even more was the fact that her young girl students were facing the same thing. So Naomi created a girls group at her school where they would talk about body image, competition, and even sexuality. She listened to her students share their stories, their concerns, their fears, and voice their curiosity. This gave her students a place to have a sense of comfort, support, and education. But it also shed a light on the overarching discrimination women are facing when it comes to sexual pleasure. Women aren't viewed by society as being deserving of sexual pleasure, but rather we are objects to satisfy a man's desires. So in this article, Naomi stated, we are sexual beings, yet even in our most intimate relationships, we often don't know how to express ourselves. The examples we see around us teach us to objectify ourselves rather than celebrate our sexuality. We often find ourselves reacting to being sexualized rather than expressing our own desires. So this is going along with the whole catcalling thing and how women only do sex for men. It's men's pleasure, and women's pleasure is neglected, not talked about, not advocated for at all. And that creates this whole stigma around us. And the last one I want to talk about is an article I found called The Stigma Surrounding Female Pleasure. So women often ask themselves, why is it that a man is free to talk about sex, free to be praised by their fathers for having sex? And how come social media platforms only portray the male satisfaction and pleasure, and that's it? It ends after the man is satisfied and pleasured. Well, I want to answer this for you a little bit. And one of the reasons is it comes down to the basics: sex education. Yep, that one day when you were little and the boys are separated from the girls and you're talked about the reproduction areas, but for girls it's more about periods, not the parts of sex that are emotional, consensual, spiritual, and pleasurable. And I wanted to hear about somebody else's story because I know my own experiences and how my sex education class was, and it was exactly like that, split up, male, female, talked about periods pretty much, and that was the end of it. So I found this article by Jasmine Taylor, and Taylor attended the George Rose conversation about female pleasure, where she completed worksheets, watched informational videos, had candid group discussions that all led to the openness of conversations. These conversations included the discussion of the female anatomy in depth, sexual vocabulary, which leads us to the lack of ownership over our bodies, the shame around sexual pleasure, the lack of sexual education, pressure for women to orgasm, and so much more. Taylor stated, as somebody whose experience of sexual education was laughably problematic, I was disappointed but unsurprised to learn that each of us in this room had similar educational experiences. Sex is represented as solely a means of reproduction, but simultaneously we are taught to avoid this. This is what we are learning about. Evidently not real life sex, our body's pleasure or sexuality, as Georgia's statistics show. So in sex education, it's not sufficient. It's not educational at all. It's talked about basically the minimal anatomy, maybe a little bit of period talk. And if the topic of actual sex and intercourse comes up, it ends with do not have it. So there's that big focus on abstinence, which also plays a role in religion and all of that. So all of these pressures kind of lead up into the reasons why women's pleasure is not normalized. Thank you.